Yeah. So I was just wondering whether we know whether the Gospels are written by the people they, I guess, kind of heavily claim to be written by. I've been reading a book that my cousin's been getting me to read, and she's a Christian. I'm not. So I was just curious what both you guys have to say about the question of do we know who wrote the Gospels?
No,
Is this good?
I answered.
No, you understand. I was gonna say, is this a plug? Because I've spent literally a whole year doing a video that I recently put up. It was literally who really wrote the Gospels, researching this quite a lot, and yet the answer is still what Matt gave. So he didn't need to spend the year on it, and that is, well, we don't. The answer is we don't know who wrote the Gospels. But Landon, I'm curious. Are you wanting us to like? Were you hoping that we would lay out the case, or did you
I
have
would
a?
hope, yeah, I was hoping for a little bit of elaboration, maybe.
Sure. Well, Paul, you spent a
Um,
year on it. You'll
yeah.
better summarize it than I will. I spent a lot of time on it. I just gave the short answer.
So, I mean, in very trying to be very brief about it, the first time we start seeing the names applied to the Gospels is around 180 AD, and there's references back to know that our Gospels have the Gospels that we know are attached to the names that we know. If you go back about 60 years earlier than that, we start seeing names and we start seeing quotes, but the names and the quotes are never put together. And in fact, when names are given, the books that are being described don't sound like the books that we know as those books. So, for example, Papias says that Matthew wrote his gospel in Hebrew. Well, the Matthew that we have was very definitely written in Greek and not translated. The book that he thinks was written by Mark was left out no detail, and yet Mark is the shortest gospel. These are just examples of things I'm trying to go quickly. So there's lots of reasons to wonder why up until 180 AD, when people would talk about the gospels, they would either specifically not give them names and or seemingly give them names that don't make sense. So it seems like what happened was in the late in the second century at some point, these names became attributed to them as other gospels sprung up. So as like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter and all these other late gospels, and they started to needing to and or well-meaning Christians were just having all four and they needed to differentiate them. So the historical case seems to be such that we don't have any strong evidence that the names in the gospels were attached until very late. Does that prove anything? It doesn't prove anything, but it also is very skeptical when you say that, hey, Matthew wrote this. And yet, in the book of Matthew, where Jesus meets Matthew, he copies it word for word from Mark. So isn't it weird that when you met your savior, you didn't have anything narratively to say about that day that you didn't copy from the other guy? You know, there's clues like this that that make it seem dubious. So I would encourage you to, as you said, to read some books, to look at the videos. I gave only 90 seconds worth of just various things that make us say, it sure seems like we don't know who wrote the Gospels. It sure seems like these fishermen that Jesus had, for example, it specifically says in the book of Acts that they are unschooled, ordinary men. And the word for unschooled in Greek means illiterate. And yet, so in your own book, you're calling these men illiterate, and yet we're supposed to suppose that they wrote books in a language they didn't speak. So these are all just clues. I don't know. And Matt can probably
Okay.
add a lot of things.
No,
I would just
go
think,
ahead.
could I ask maybe just a couple more questions because these
Please do.
questions are not really for me. My cousin was. I read the book for her. She's a Christian. I'm not. So I just came on here asking some questions for her mostly. One thing in the book that I read that she got me to read was why do we not see any gospel like the texts that have different names attributed to them? Why is there no gospel of Mark that the exact same text is attributed to anybody else besides Mark or vice versa,
Because
the other gospels?
the church's attributions won out. It's not hidden. None of this stuff is hidden. Like if you open up, wow, I used to have an NIV sitting right next to me here, and I don't. Oh, here we go. So this is an NIV. You're going to find people who want to, discount this version of the Bible or King James only, etc. But if you actually open the book, there's a cover page for every one of the books. And so if you go to, I'm trying to open it to the cover page for Matthew without actually skipping past it. And I have the wrong glasses on for this. But here, looking at the NIV, it says, although the first gospel is anonymous, the early church fathers were unanimous in holding that Matthew, one of the 12 apostles, was its author. However, the result of modern critical studies, in particular those that stress Matthew's alleged dependence on Mark for a substantial part of his gospel, have caused some biblical scholars to abandon Matthean authorship. Why, they ask, would Matthew, an eyewitness to the events of our Lord's life, depend so heavily on Mark's account? The best answer seems to be that he agreed with it and wanted to show that the apostolic testimony to Christ was not divided. This is at least not hidden. I mean, it's literally the cover page in the NIV for the book of Matthew. It says, and it's basically saying, we don't know who wrote this. It is church tradition that attributes it to Matthew, but there is no evidence that it's actually written by Matthew. And there's good reason to suspect that it wasn't written by, a firsthand eyewitness or anything like that. All of that's in the book, and a quick Google search on gospel authorship will go through a lot of this as well as one of my favorite websites, earlychristianwritings.com, will go through a lot of the, best sources to talk about things like authorship and interpretation, all this other stuff. It's not like, I would imagine there are thousands of Christians sitting in church with this is one of the most popular Bibles on the planet, this particular NIV. And it's not, it is a copyrighted thing. So you can't, unlike, King James and things that are in the public domain, you can't just quote from it without potentially, violating it. You can for fair use and criticism and stuff like that. But I'd imagine that there are tons of Christians sitting there with this exact Bible who still think that the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew. They didn't even bother reading the cover page. They haven't even bothered looking into this. It's amazing how all of these theists are somehow armchair experts when you want to talk to them about authorship, despite the fact that almost none of them have looked into it. And at the end of the day, who wrote Matthew is really irrelevant. It's how accurate is it? Because it could be very accurate no matter who wrote it, or it could be inaccurate no matter who wrote it. But the fact that we don't know who wrote it and that we don't have a way to tell how accurate is it on any number of things, that's the problem. And so, yeah, we can look into the authorship, but we're kind of stuck.
The
Yeah, I agree with, I think, all of that. As I said, I'm an atheist, and I'm trying to
Right.
help my cousin out here, and she seems very determined to show these certain things. And I read this book, and this one thing in this whole, like, it was about an 8-hour book that I read, stuck out to me, that if the the early church fathers, and there was no other names attributed to the early gospels, if they were just randomly attributed, you would think, or I initially thought, like, that seemed odd, that if there's these texts out there from very, very early on, before 200 CE, there might be more than one name attributed to these texts, but we don't have any
So
example
Landon,
of that. It seems
so Landon,
unanimous.
what you're saying,
They all thought, yeah, okay.
what you're saying is half true. The early church fathers do quote from these books, and when they do so, they say things like from the Gospel of the Apostles, or they actually will use sort of what they were probably using as titles, but they're not Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. But they're also not other people. So
No,
okay,
that's
so
not
they
what
don't,
I'm saying.
so they don't use another name, but they do.
No, I agree with that.
Refer to the books. And so it's weird that when these earliest church fathers if those names were in
Can you stop
circulation,
breathing into the mic on your phone? Thanks.
they would do that. The other thing is, if she's asked, or your friend, I guess, I don't know if your friend is asking, what about, why aren't there manuscripts that that have this. Well, you look it up, the earliest manuscript we have of Mark that has the full complete title page to it is from like 300 or 400 AD, right? It's not well after the time that we're even talking about. Same with the first copy of Matthew, which is manuscript P1. It looks like the very top, we have the very top of it, and there's no title at all. So again, these are half truths. The earliest ones we have only are unanimous in what titles they give, but the earliest ones we have are way after this whole period that we're talking about, when they're anonymous or not. So you need to look up these half truths. And I would say the same is probably true about my work. Double check, make sure that I'm not, misattributing and saying these half truths, but these are not great points without an easy answer if you just do a Google search.
It's
I,
also
I was
the implied argument there is, it seems strange that there would only be one name attributed to this. Why does that seem strange? There is no signed copy. We have no way of investigating and determining who it is. And the church, which controls and dictates things to believers, established a name and was, for the most part, honest about it from the get go. If the church says this is the gospel according to Matthew, can't demonstrate that it's Matthew, and nobody else has a way to demonstrate that it's anybody else, why would it be surprising that the church's story wins out? What's the competing story and what's the evidence anybody could present? They have no way of showing anybody else wrote it. They have no signed copies, and they're going up against the church, who puts itself in a position of authority. Frankly, I'd be shocked if there were people who were trying to make an argument for specific authorship from anybody else.
so the thing I found weird was, since there's other gospels that the church doesn't agree with, it 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 just seems like there should be other copies out there that, like, maybe not that we should have found, but there seems like there should be other copies out there of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, like the exact same text, that have different names attributed to them.
Why?
If they were
Why?
just
Why?
randomly,
Why?
if they were just, if well, I'm trying to, if the people were trying to attribute those names for their own
Hello? Hello? I think you muted yourself.
Or I'll get disconnected maybe.
testing.
Hello? Yep.
Oh,
Oh,
can
Hello?
you hear me? Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
So
Um,
why do you
so
think there would be other copies that were attributed to other people?
because it just seems like, so there's other gospels that didn't make it into the Bible, and I
Yes.
it just seems very, very odd that we would not, like, if those 4 gospels, those names attributed to them were just there for authority or some other kind of reason besides actually thinking those people actually wrote those gospels. There would be other gospels that were the exact same kind of text that would have other names to them. Seemed
Why?
that was the only thing in the book that
You just
I read
keep
that seemed a little
saying the
bit odd.
same thing. Landon, stop. You just keep saying
Yeah.
that it's surprising, and I keep saying why. Are you going to get to the why? Does it seem surprising?
Um, why were those names attributed?
I don't
Why
know. I
were
don't have a time machine. What difference does it make? Asking a question of why were those names attributed in no way explains why you find it surprising that there aren't other copies of the same book with other names. But first of all, this is during a period of time where a good chunk of the people were illiterate, where books were precious and rare. There's also no signed authorship, and there were known forgeries going around, to the point where Paul has to remind people, even in his books, even in one of the forgeries, somebody pretending to be Paul says, I Paul, write this with my own hand. And one of the things was that once the church asserts, hey, this was actually written um, by Matthew, who's going to challenge that? And how is there going to be any foothold to that? So even if there were other books floating around in the second century that were, other copies of this, that somebody says, oh, no, this is actually from, James or whatever. Once the church steps up and says this, it's not like we have multiple copies of this. We don't have full copies of any of the originals of any of these. We have scraps of these.
I
So
get
why is
that.
it surprising? So why is it surprising that you don't have other copies of the Gospel of Matthew that are attributed to somebody else?
Because I think the question is, like, if the name attributed to Matthew or Mark or Luke or John is just for an authoritative reason or some other reasons, you might suspect that there would be other churches in the area that would attribute a different name to them. Like, because
Yes. And
it's not historical.
you might suspect that there were other things that didn't make it into the Bible, because there were
Yeah, I agree with that.
lots of them. The Passion narrative, Q, the Signs Gospel, the Gospel of
But that's
Thomas, the
going a little bit
Apocalypse of
off the point,
Adam.
right, Matt?
Sorry,
Well,
what?
let
Are you suggesting that I'm off point on my own show while asking you repeatedly the same question on why you find something surprising?
Yeah, I'm saying that it's
Cool, thanks.
the I'm sorry. Sorry. The thing I was, like, just calling it about on this I've read this, it was about an AR book, and this was the only thing that I found maybe a little bit interesting in the whole book, that if the early church fathers of the gospel, they seem to all agree on who wrote the gospels, and we don't have any record of anybody
I
else
urge
saying
you,
any okay, yeah, okay.
I urge you to just go and investigate which church fathers you think are early and which ones you think are late, because it's easy to lump them all together. And the earliest ones don't. Sorry about my dog. The earliest ones don't attribute any name at all. It's the late ones that do, and the fact that the late ones are unanimous is kind of are you aware of argument from silence, right, Landon? Like, it's like you're arguing that no one.
Yeah,
You're
yeah,
arguing that no
yeah.
one did a thing.
Justin Martyr and a lot of the very early people, they don't name the gospels at all when they mention these kind of things. And
Right.
I think
And
that's the
Wow.
so,
best evidence for the case that you're making.
right. And so you're surprised that we don't have a certain piece of evidence, but we're talking about a time period where, first of all, like, it was something had to be copied and copied and copied and copied for it to make it to where we are. So we have no idea what people were writing and saying in that time period, right? That's just silence. And we also know that things that were later heretical were copied less. So if people had been saying that this was actually the gospel of Bartholomew, if a handful of people were doing that, that probably wouldn't get copied to the point where we now have a copy, right? Because they were in defiance. So
Yeah.
occasionally you get defiance, and that's fine, but you don't expect to find every polemic against that was being discussed or issued in the day. So I think the thing you're finding really compelling is really just an argument from silence. Do you agree?
Halfway, I think that what you just said, like, we don't actually have any examples of defiance when it comes to the gospel, or I think the argument that I'm going to make to her is even the forgery of, like Judah,
Right.
Mary, and all those kind of things. It that just seems odd to me, though, honestly. Like, I figure we'd have some people that would
I
have
don't care.
taken these same texts and put a different name to them.
I disagree, and I don't care that it seems odd to you. We've been over this.
All right. I've taken enough time, probably.
Cool.
Keep
I
keep
would
asking
recommend that.
questions.
Yeah, yeah. If you think it's odd, go out and research it. See if you can find an example. See if you can make a case. See if you can do something scholarship wise. I'm not here just to, hey, do you think it's weird that the Gospel of Matthew, that was attributed that name by church fathers a little late, wasn't attributed to somebody else early? And my other question is, how do you know it wasn't? How do you know the church didn't destroy any attempts by this? It's not like we
Yeah.
have any copies. We have no full copies of any of this. We have no autographs. We don't have a way to investigate it. And the winners are the ones writing history. To say that it's a bit odd that you haven't found one is like saying it's a bit odd that we haven't found an entire full, you know, first
Yeah.
generation copy of the Gospel of Matthew. Okay, well, it can seem odd, except that they're incredibly rare.
No, I don't think that's odd. I think Paulogia described earlier why I think there's good reasons to think that the earlier manuscripts didn't have any names attribution at all. I think we have good
Okay.
reasons in thinking that.
Maybe they didn't. Maybe they did and they were hidden. Maybe they were did and they were lost. Maybe they
Yeah.
did in some tiny pocket in some church in Ethiopia has a Gospel of Mark that's labeled, you know, as Simon. But
Yep.
the fact that we don't, have a copy of the Gospel of Matthew that's attributed to somebody else is no more surprising to me than we don't have an original copy of Matthew.
I think that's a fair point.